My name is Jessica. If you had met me a year ago, you would have thought I was living the perfect life. A house in the suburbs of Colorado, two wonderful daughters, a job I love, and my husband Ryan, the very man I'd been through everything with. "I'll be home late today," Ryan said, kissing me before leaving. "This project is draining all my energy." "As always," I replied with a smile, though something inside me tightened. One day, on my way back from work, I decided to stop by the local yoga center. I had long wanted to try something new, to clear my mind. There was a seminar on mindfulness and mental health going on. I had never attended anything like that, but something pushed me to go. People gathered in a small, cozy room, everyone looking relaxed. In the center stood the speaker, a man in his 40s, calm and self-assured, with a soft voice. "Hello, my name is Alan. Today we'll be talking about the importance of mindfulness and inner balance in everyday life. Listen to yourself. Be aware of your feelings." His words seemed simple, but something about them struck a chord with me. I sat there, listening attentively, and suddenly realized I hadn't really listened to myself in a long time. Certainly not in the way Alan suggested. After the seminar, I approached him to say thank you. "That was very helpful," I said, slightly embarrassed. I didn't think such a simple discussion could touch me so deeply. He smiled. "I'm glad you liked it. If you'd like, we can continue this conversation. I offer free consultations. Sometimes one simple discussion can change a lot in life." I nodded, though at that moment I didn't fully understand what had compelled me to book an appointment. Maybe it was the internal emptiness I had been ignoring for so long but could no longer deny. A few days later, I was already sitting in his office. The light was soft, the atmosphere relaxing. I felt how easy it was to talk to him. He didn't ask difficult questions. We just talked. About family, about Ryan, about the kids, about how things had changed over the past few years. I didn't even notice when I started to open up. "Ryan travels a lot," I said, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. "We hardly talk anymore. Sometimes it feels like he's just disappearing, and I'm disappearing with him." Alan listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer ready-made solutions. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was truly hearing me. As I was leaving, he said, "We often forget about ourselves while living for others. If you'd like, we can meet again. There's a lot worth discussing." I agreed. And maybe at that moment, something inside me began to change, though I wasn't aware of it then. The continuation of those meetings would change my life beyond recognition, but I didn't know that yet. One day, during one of our sessions, Alan calmly said, "You mentioned that you feel lost. Why do you think it's connected to Ryan?" I paused before answering. Ryan and I have been together for a long time, but now everything feels mechanical, you know? He's always busy and I don't feel any connection with him. We used to talk about everything, but now it feels like there's nothing left. Alan nodded, studying me closely. "And what do you feel about yourself, Jessica? Have you ever thought that this might not only be about Ryan, but also about you?" His question caught me off guard. I hadn't considered that. Everything seemed so simple. Ryan was pulling away, and I was suffering. But his words made me think. Could it really not just be about Ryan? When Ryan finally came home that evening, exhausted and worn out, I met him in the hallway. "You look terrible," I said, trying to start a conversation. He just nodded and headed straight for the fridge to grab something to eat. My words hung in the air, and as always, no response followed. It was as if there was a wall between us. I felt distant. Perhaps for the first time, I began to realize that our relationship wasn't what it used to be. Had everything really changed so much that I couldn't bring us back? The next meeting with Alan already felt like a necessity. I could no longer stay silent. I needed to talk, not just about the marriage, but about how I had lost myself in the process. I had a strange feeling before the next session. Not only did I want to talk about my emotions, but I also found comfort simply being in Alan's presence. He was someone who knew how to listen. You mentioned feeling lost, Alan reminded me as we sat in his cozy, softly lit office. Have you started looking for answers? I sighed, unsure if I should tell the truth, but I decided not to hold back. I've been thinking that the problem might not only be with Ryan, I began. All this time I've blamed him for our distance, for the fact that we're no longer close. But maybe it's me. I feel empty. I don't even know who I am anymore. Alan nodded, his gaze attentive and calm. When we forget about ourselves and our desires, our relationships inevitably suffer. Maybe you've become so wrapped up in your roles as a wife and mother that you've lost touch with the Jessica you used to be. I frowned, contemplating his words. But how do I get that back? I feel like it's too late. Ryan and I are so far apart. I don't even know where to start. Start small, he replied with a slight smile. Allow yourself to listen to your own desires. You mentioned you used to love painting? What's stopping you from going back to that? Find something that brings you joy outside of your marriage. Then see how that affects the relationship. I was grateful for his advice, but there was something about his tone, the way he spoke, that caught my attention. In his eyes, I saw more than just professional concern. At the next session, our conversation flowed easily once again. But this time, when I was talking, he leaned in a little closer, and in his eyes, I noticed the same look as before. A special attention that went beyond the usual care of a therapist. At one point, when our eyes met, I felt a strange pull between us. We were silent for a few seconds, and I could feel the atmosphere in the room shift. It was something involuntary, unplanned. Alan quickly looked away, but the moment had already happened. Maybe you should consider doing something for yourself to relax, he unexpectedly suggested. I'm organizing a retreat soon for a small group of people. It'll be a weekend getaway where you can disconnect from everything and recharge. I think it could be good for you. I hesitated. Taking part in such an event seemed out of place. It wasn't what I expected from therapy. I'll think about it, I replied, trying to hide my confusion. After that meeting with Alan, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring at my phone. His offer for the retreat kept spinning in my mind. I understood that it could be something important for me, a way to escape the routine, to find answers to the questions that had been bothering me for so long. But there was something about it that felt off. Mama, when will Dad be back? My younger daughter asked, peeking into the kitchen. I looked at her and realized I didn't know. Ryan was away on another business trip, and his absence had become the norm. Soon, sweetheart. Very soon. But even to myself, the words felt hollow. We went out of town for the weekend. A small group of people, all strangers to each other. We stayed in a cozy wooden cabin surrounded by mountains and forest. Alan was the organizer and the main facilitator. He led sessions on meditation, breathing exercises, and relaxation techniques designed to help us release tension and listen to our own desires. The most important thing you need to do, Alan said during one of the group sessions, is to allow yourself to be with yourself. Listen to your inner voice and don't get caught up in the noise and demands of everyday life. It sounded simple, but at that moment I realized how deeply I had been consumed by family concerns, how long I had stopped listening to myself. Around me there was only the silence of nature, but inside I felt chaos. After the evening session, when everyone had retreated to their rooms, I stayed by the fireplace. Alan approached me and I looked up, sensing his presence. How do you feel? He asked. I smiled slightly. Honestly, strange. I haven't felt this open in a long time. Sometimes being open with yourself is the hardest thing, Alan said, his voice soft like silk. But it's an important step. I nodded, feeling something shift inside me, like ice cracking beneath the surface. He paused, then said, Jessica, if you ever want to talk privately, I'm here. You know you can trust me. And then he reached out, gently touching my hand. It was just a moment, such a light touch, but it was so palpable that I shivered. Our eyes met. After a few seconds, we kissed. After that night by the fireplace, everything changed. Alan and I were no longer just therapist and client, and that realization lingered in the air during each of our meetings. The morning after the retreat, I woke up with a heavy feeling, as if I had already taken a step I couldn't retreat from. When we drove back to the city, Alan offered to take me home. I didn't agree right away, but the desire to be near him overpowered my logic. On the drive, we sat in silence, both lost in our thoughts. "Jessica," he said when we pulled up to my house, "I know what you're going through right now. It's normal. If you want, we can meet outside of sessions, just to talk. No pressure." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. For the next few days, I tried to return to normal life. I worked, spent time with the kids, cleaned the house. But thoughts of Alan wouldn't leave me. I couldn't shake the memory of that evening, of his touch and the look in his eyes, which spoke more than words ever could. My entire life started to feel like it belonged to someone else. Like I was playing a role in a film, where real emotions were far away from me. Ryan returned from his trip, exhausted as always. We had dinner together, but once again, the conversation was reduced to discussing the kids and work. I wanted to tell him how I felt, but every time I found the words, something stopped me. There was no point. "How are you?" he suddenly asked during dinner. The simple question caught me off guard. "Fine," I replied, as usual. "And you?" He shrugged, looked away, and buried himself in his phone again. The moment for a real conversation slipped away. A few days later, I met with Alan again. This time, not in his office. We met at a small cafe in the city center. I wasn't sure why I had come, but something inside me craved the connection. We talked about anything but therapy. Life, hobbies, even the weather. It felt strange, but so easy. At one point, our conversation paused, and Alan looked at me again, just like he did that night. There was silence in his gaze, but also tension. He slowly reached out and covered my hand with his. "Jessica, I can't ignore this," he said softly. "I feel there's something more between us." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know how to respond. Silence hung between us, filled with the realization that this was more than just an attraction. "I feel it too," I whispered. It was an admission after which there was no turning back. Alan and I had grown very close. When Ryan came home that evening, I realized I could no longer look at him the same way I once did. I felt like a stranger in my own house, and Ryan was a man I could no longer call my own. He had no idea. As usual, he sat down with his laptop after dinner, immersed in work documents, while I quietly cleared the table. "How was your day?" he finally asked, without lifting his eyes from the screen. "Fine," I said, trying to suppress the overwhelming guilt creeping over me. "Ryan, maybe we should spend more time together?" I suggested, feeling tense from my own words. "It's been a while since we've spent any time alone." He looked at me, clearly surprised by my sudden initiative. "We both have so much going on, Jess," he said, tired. "I'm barely keeping up with work, and the kids need attention." I realized he didn't understand my suggestion. Or perhaps he didn't want to. Maybe, like me, he sensed the growing distance between us but didn't know how to bridge it. This conversation only deepened my sense of loneliness. We were both drowning, and neither of us knew how to find our way back. A few days later, I met with Alan again. "I've been thinking about what we're doing," I said, staring at his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "It's wrong, Alan." He was silent for a moment before quietly replying, "I know. But what I feel for you won't just go away. You mean more to me than just a client." "What are we supposed to do?" I asked, knowing there was no answer that could save us all. "We don't have to make a decision right now," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We can just be." But I knew that just being was no longer possible. Ryan suspected nothing. His work still consumed most of his time. He'd leave for a few days, return, and dive right back into his projects. We lived like roommates, sharing the same space but nothing more. "You look different," he commented one evening over dinner, glancing at me briefly. "Is everything okay?" "Of course," I lied, forcing a smile. His question triggered something inside me. He had known me for so many years, yet now it felt like he was looking at a stranger. I could have told him how lost I felt, how confused I was, but I was afraid that it would be the beginning of the end. A few days later, I noticed something odd. I picked up Ryan's phone to check when his next trip would be, and I accidentally stumbled upon a message from a woman I didn't know, Claire. The message was brief, but its tone felt too personal for just a colleague. My heart sank. I immediately felt that something was wrong. Those few words I read were filled with more than just work. They carried the warmth I had been missing in our relationship for so long. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Maybe it was nothing? Maybe I was imagining it all? But my intuition screamed otherwise. That evening, when Ryan came home, I decided not to confront him right away. I watched him closely, studied his every move, trying to catch any subtle signs. We had dinner as usual, but the silence between us was growing unbearable. "Ryan," I finally began, gathering my courage. "You've been working a lot lately. I found a message from Claire. Who is she?" He froze for a moment, but then sighed, meeting my eyes. "Claire, she's on my team. We're working on a project together. We text sometimes. It's just work." His voice was steady, but I sensed a hidden tension. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at me. Something wasn't right. And now I knew I wasn't alone in my suspicions. If Ryan was hiding something, then maybe we had both been living in lies all this time. The next day, I decided to meet with Alan. I needed to talk, to share my doubts. We met in the same small cafe on the edge of town. I told him about Claire, about the nagging suspicion that was eating at me. "Maybe Ryan has someone too," I said, staring at the coffee cup I was nervously turning in my hands. "I don't know what to do. It's strange. It feels like we're both lost." Alan listened intently, as always, but this time his expression was more serious than usual. "Jessica," he said softly, "you might be right, but before jumping to conclusions, talk to him. You need to find out the truth." I nodded, though I knew that this conversation with Ryan would be the hardest one we'd ever had. I was burning inside, already on the edge, unsure how much longer I could pretend everything was fine. "Whatever you decide," Alan continued, "I'll be here for you. But be honest, with yourself and with him." His words pierced deeper than I expected. Now, I stood at the edge of a decision that would change everything. That evening, I sat in the kitchen as if waiting for a sentence to be handed down. Ryan was due back from work in an hour, and I knew I couldn't put off this conversation any longer. The air had been heavy ever since I'd found that message, and time was slipping away while I felt my world teetering on the edge of collapse. When the door finally opened and Ryan walked in, I tensed. He looked as tired as ever, but there was something in his demeanor that seemed more guarded. Our eyes didn't meet, as if we were both afraid to begin. "We need to talk," I started, my heart pounding in my chest. Ryan froze by the table, sensing the tension in my voice. He didn't sit, like he usually would, but stood there, looking at me cautiously. "I know about Claire," I said directly, watching his reaction. "You lied to me." He blinked, then sighed heavily, lowering his eyes. "Jessica," he began, clearly trying to find the right words. "It's not what you think." My heart skipped a beat. Those words always meant the truth was worse than you imagined. "Are you seeing her?" I asked bluntly, not giving him a chance to dodge the question. He looked at me, and the confidence that had once filled his gaze was gone. I saw confusion, like he too was tired of playing this game. "Yes," he finally said softly. "We started talking at work, and it just happened. I never wanted it to end up like this." My hands trembled. Despite my suspicions, hearing it from him was painful. We had become strangers to each other, and now that truth was impossible to ignore. Why didn't you tell me earlier? I could barely speak, my voice low and almost inaudible. We could have at least tried to fix things. Ryan sat down across from me, burying his face in his hands. I don't know. He breathed out, as though the weight of the world had fallen on his shoulders. I was caught up in work. You were distant. We both got too lost in our own lives. I stayed silent, trying to process everything. Our entire life together now appeared in a different light. We had both been hiding something, both lost in our own illusions. And now what was left? What about you? Ryan suddenly asked, his voice hoarse. You've been hiding something too, Jessica. I can feel it. I stiffened. His words were unexpected, but true. I had been lying too. I had fallen into my own relationship with Alan, even though I never thought I'd end up in this kind of situation. I stayed quiet for a long time before finally answering. Yes, I said softly. I made a mistake too. I got close to someone else. A heavy silence filled the room. Ryan froze as if he had just heard the most unexpected confession. His eyes, full of disappointment and bitterness, met mine. Is this all that's left of us? He asked after a long pause. We destroyed everything we had. I felt a wave of emotions wash over me. This was the end of our marriage, the end of all illusions. We had both destroyed it, each in our own way. And now, sitting across from each other in this silence, there was no more pretending. I don't know, Ryan. I answered honestly. But I think it's too late to fix anything. We sat in that silence for a long time, both realizing that together we had broken what once held us together. Several days had passed since that conversation, and now everything around me felt different. The house, which had once been my sanctuary, was now full of ghosts. Ghosts of lost hopes, broken promises, and severed connections. I wandered through the rooms, feeling like I was in a place that no longer belonged to me. Ryan barely spoke to me after that. We were like two strangers, trapped in the same space. We can't live like this, I finally said softly, breaking the silence. Ryan slowly lifted his head, his eyes tired and filled with unresolved questions. I know, he sighed, not moving from his spot. But what are we supposed to do? How do we fix this? His words were the ones I had been waiting to hear, but also the ones I dreaded. There's nothing to fix, I admitted, my voice tinged with pain. We both destroyed this marriage. You with Claire, me with Alan. We've drifted so far apart that there's no way back. He closed his eyes and ran his hand over his face as if trying to wipe away the reality of it all. You're right, he said after a long pause. We've gone too far. I can't forget what happened. And I know you can't forget about me and Claire. I nodded. He was right. No matter how hard we tried to turn things around, we had both changed, and the trust between us was broken. We sat on the couch in silence, but this time, the silence was different. It was a silence of acceptance. We need to move on, I finally said. For ourselves and for the kids. We can't pretend for their sake. That would make it worse. He didn't respond, but his silence was agreement. This was the moment we both acknowledged the inevitable. We both knew our marriage was over. In the days that followed, we discussed the details. We decided to part ways peacefully, without drama or blame. We both wanted to do everything we could to minimize the impact on the kids. We began talking about legal matters, dividing our assets, and sharing custody. It was all done quietly, calmly, as though we had been preparing for this for a long time. It was strange. Our relationship ended not with shouting or accusations, but with a quiet understanding that we were both at fault. One evening, as Ryan was packing his things to move into his apartment, I realized that despite everything, we were still able to talk to each other honestly, even if it was painful. Do you think we could have done something differently? I asked, watching him through the open bedroom door. He paused, folding shirts into his suitcase, and looked at me thoughtfully. "I don't know," he said after a pause. "Maybe if we had started talking sooner, but I think it was inevitable." I nodded. There was truth in his words. We had both stayed silent for too long, tried for too long to maintain the illusion of normalcy without addressing the cracks growing between us. And now we had ended up in a place neither of us wanted to be, but there was no way back. When Ryan finally left, I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. On one hand, it was a goodbye to a life that had once been happy. On the other, it was the beginning of something new, something frightening, but inevitable. Now I stood on the threshold of a new life, and I had to decide how to build my future from here. After Ryan left, the house became quiet, almost haunting in its emptiness. The children stayed with me most of the time, but when they went to Ryan's, the silence filled every corner, reminding me that everything had changed. It was the end of a chapter I had once considered my life. I returned to work, trying to immerse myself in familiar tasks, but everything felt different now. My colleagues noticed the change, though no one asked directly. On the outside, I appeared calm, but inside I was still grappling with the contradictions. I had to face the fact that I, like Ryan, had also played a part in the destruction of our marriage. But more than anything, I thought about Alan. Our meetings had stopped after I told Ryan the truth. It seemed that our relationship, no matter how passionate, had been an escape from reality, a way to seek comfort in someone else when my marriage was falling apart. Now, I understood that the feelings I had for Alan weren't love. They were a way of running away from myself. One day, several weeks after Ryan left, I decided to meet with Alan one last time. It wasn't so much a call of the heart as it was a desire to close the final unresolved chapter of my life. We met at the same cafe where we'd once had long, intimate conversations. "Hi, Jessica," Alan said as I sat across from him. His face was calm, but there was a question in his eyes. "Hi, Alan," I replied, trying to understand what I felt in that moment. We sat in silence for a few minutes. I realized that everything that had happened between us had been a result of my internal conflicts, my pain and my desire to escape reality. But now, sitting across from him, I felt like a different person. The emotions that had once felt so powerful were now just echoes of the turmoil I had been going through. "I wanted to say that it wasn't about you," I began quietly. "What happened between us? It was about me trying to find in you what was missing in my marriage. But it wasn't a solution, just a temporary escape. I'm not the same person I was then." Alan listened attentively, his face remaining calm. "I understand," he said, nodding slightly. "We both got caught up in those feelings. But I'm glad you found your way, Jessica. That's what's most important." I felt a sense of relief as those words were spoken. I knew there was nothing left between us. This was the end, not just of our relationship, but of the part of my life where I had been running from myself. In the following months, I began to rebuild my life. I found activities that brought me joy, and I returned to painting, something I had neglected for years. I even signed up for art classes, and they filled me with a sense of creativity and freedom that I had long been missing. Ryan and I managed to establish a friendly relationship for the sake of the kids. It wasn't easy, but we both knew that our marriage hadn't been destroyed by a single act, but by years of unresolved problems. Now, we were trying to be better parents than we had been partners. I learned to live with the fact that we both made mistakes. But I no longer wanted to run away. I wanted to be myself, authentic, and to build my life not for someone else, but for myself.